This is the Real Coaching Podcast. I'm Joel Filliol, and we're back this week with Paulo Sousa.
Hi, Joel. How are you?
Doing well. So this week we've got a training topic that we've been keen to talk about: polarized training. So we're going to go into that, but first we have a number of follow-up items that either came in via Facebook or via podcast at joelfilliol.com or via Twitter. So we thought we'd cover a few of those. First, we're on iTunes now, so thanks for those that have subscribed. So we've had a bunch of feedback. So one of the first questions, and it was a common question that we seem to be getting, is coaches interested in coaching at the elite level and wondering how you get there. What's the pathway, if you like? You know, maybe they're coaching age groupers or juniors or under 23s and thinking, how do they move through the system, as it were? Is there a system? Is there a pathway? And so we've seen that from a few different coaches, and it's something interesting I think we can talk a little bit about.
Well, you know, and I'm sure it happened to you before and has happened to me. People approach you and ask you like, what do you think I should be doing to become an elite coach? And they talk about pathway, they talk about mentorship, they talk about what needs to be done. But in my mind, it always starts with doing your job with the athletes that you have. And I know it sounds simplistic, but it's basically, if you do a good job with the athlete that you have, then opportunities are going to multiply, and you're going to get better athletes, and with better athletes, you're going to be able to have even better results. So basically, it starts with doing your job every day, getting good results, and build upon the results that you've had before. It's obviously it's a path that is very full of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but it always starts with doing your job.
I mean, it's a very simple answer, but it's very true. And it's like that in any line of work, isn't it? If you want to progress, you do a good job, you get noticed, you get further opportunities, maybe more interesting or advanced opportunities. Sometimes maybe you wish you didn't because it comes with more pressure and expectation. However, you do a good job and you move up and doors open for you. And I really think it's important that coaches that are interested in elite athletes, that don't sort of say, I've got no good athletes, or, I don't have talent, because as I've got on my website, and a nice quote from Arthur Lydiard, I mean, champions are all around us. All you have to do is train them properly. And without getting into whole nature and nurture, etc., maybe you don't have an Olympic champion in your group or within your coaching sphere, but I bet you've got some reasonably good athletes. And if you train them well in a patient way and coach them well, they're going to improve, and that's going to open doors.
Yeah, a lot of times, and I'm sure. I mean, it has happened to me where I'm thinking I'm frustrated with the athlete that I have, and I think that the mindset needs to turn into just like, no, doing a great job with the athlete that I have right now. It's first a sure way of doing your job, which means like you are developing the athletes that you have, and that's doing your job, but also an opportunity to be noticed and to have results, and with those results will give more consistency to your work. A lot of the times, I think it's the main thing here that both of us are saying is change the mindset about like what I should be doing. A little bit of like looking for clues, but more change it to I need to focus on doing my job with the athletes that I have right now. And if you do, and if you're good at it, because I mean, let's just say that it's not everybody that's going to have the necessary skills and attitude to be an elite coach. But if you have those skills and if you do your job, then you will become an elite coach.
Indeed. So moving on, the next question was how does triathlon coaching differ from single sport cycling, running, or swimming coaching? What's your opinion on this?
Well, I've never really have done any single sport coaching, so it's kind of hard to have a point of comparison. But in my view, like, I think one thing that distinguishes triathlon from single sport is the amount of work and the interactions that you have to take into account between swim, bike, and run training. So basically, it's not a question of just thinking about training as individually, like, oh, this is the swim training, this is the cycling training, this is the running training individually, but also when you're planning a micro or a macro cycle, you're thinking that about the interactions between the training. And I don't think that's going to be a big factor in single sport, because you might have, for example, like in single sport, you might have the interaction between strength training and specific training, but that's going to be an easier, quote unquote, interaction to take care than in triathlon, where the amount of work that you do in the three disciplines is so big in comparison with the three.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I would say for my answer, my version would be, well, coaching is coaching and it's people, so it's not different. However, the nuances that you describe, I mean, the sheer amount of training and frequency that you can do in triathlon just dwarfs single sport. And therefore there's complexities and interactions that have to be considered. And it's why the model of having single discipline coaches typically fails in triathlon. Mm-hmm. So having a separate swim, bike, and run coach, in my view, is rarely successful, except in certain circumstances where an athlete maybe has a swim background and they swim with a swim group, so it doesn't really matter what they do exactly. But even then, there can be challenges and interactions. So, I think those are the differences. I mean, that's a topic for a whole discussion, but it's why. There's an art to it. I mean, we're going to get into this talking about planning and periodization to some degree and intensity distribution. But it's what makes it challenging to talk about it, because of the different interactions between the three sports and the intensities.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it's interesting that, for example, like in running, particularly in running, training is. You talk to a lot of coaches, and they follow very simple periodization schemes and ways of working. I was talking to a college coach a few months ago, and he was telling me that this is a very successful college coach, and he was telling me something like, well, we pretty much do the same thing, the same structure the whole year, and even the workouts that we do are pretty. They don't differ. They're not very different between the beginning of the season or late season, and if you apply that concept to triathlon training, you're still going to have, or to swim, bike, and run training, you're still going to have additional complexities with the interactions between the three sports. So there's definitely a level of complexity with triathlon training that doesn't exist with single sport training. Obviously, on the coaching side of things, on the day-to-day management and interacting with the athletes and all that stuff, obviously that's where things are closer, and I think that's where the lessons can be, or the bigger lessons can be learned.
So another question that we had was kind of with athletes being well rested and healthy, and how we do that under high stakes racing pressures. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, the first thing, just when I hear the well rested expression, I always think that well rested is not really one of the goals for the training process. I would say that well adapted is the goal that we have, and rest doesn't equal adaptation. Even if a lot of people confuse that, thinking that we've done the work, and the way to seek adaptation is through rest. And a lot of the times it's not going to be through rest. It's going to be through different methods of training, or different modes of training. But basically, I think that picking up the context on that question, which is with the amount of racing, I think we discussed that before, which is when in season, particularly for ITU athletes, a lot of the times there's not a lot of training that you can do in season, and what you do in between races is very, very important, not because it's training, but because it has the potential to either maintain the training adaptations or maintain the level of fitness that the athletes have, or decrease it altogether. So, and I would say that going with an approach where you're seeking that your athletes are well rested is probably not going to be the best approach. I would prefer much more the concept of freshness, or being fresh, and again, being rested doesn't mean that you're going to be fresh.
I mean, it's a really interesting concept, isn't it? I mean, recovery and all of these modalities, and there's so much focus on recovery now, but perhaps it's missing the context that you're talking about, which is readiness to compete. And even when we get into planning, and we think about how we structure the season, I think when we overemphasize this well-restedness, or thought of trying to be rested, and towards sort of peaking, quote unquote peaking, and I think this concept, again, we could have a whole discussion on that, because I mean it's far too in depth of to answer in one question, but I think you highlight the context is important, and of course keeping healthy. The other side of that is, I'd say my answer to that is once you're in season, and the level of work, the foundation is done, you can top that up, but you can't make big progress in condition during the season. And I think we get into trouble when we try to do that. We try to, we're like, oh, we've not had the results we want. Now let's really start training in the season, and that things start to go wrong. Or under high stakes, we tend to make errors. We tend to get emotions come into play, and we become irrational about what we're trying to do. We can all think of athletes, maybe they've had a bad race. Well, how do you deal with that? What are you going to do with their training? And things tend to go wrong when you try to compensate for those. So that might be an interesting topic to have a whole podcast on, preparation, readiness, and recovery. But we should move on. So another question was about mentorship, and I think we covered this to some degree in our first episode. Just the question was really who are your mentors, and as far as mentors as coaches.
I think we talked about it before. I feel that I don't see things. Obviously, you have been a mentor for me for a long time, but I don't think it's in the sense that a lot of people see, which is, the relationship that we have was never like, hey, Joel, tell me how you do this. Tell me how you do that. Tell me how I should plan this block of training. It's never been like that, but it's been more about observation of your methods and how you do things, and that allowed me to learn a lot from that experience. But a lot of the times, a lot of people see mentorship as basically, kind of like learning from the master, and that means learning everything from the master. So basically, here's my training plans, and here's the my decision logic. If I do this, then that happens, and all that stuff. And I think that's understanding things in from the wrong perspective. For example, I've read stuff, or I've followed some people that I've never had conversations with, but that I have learned from just by observation and seeing what they do. And there were mentors at a distance, but never with the mentor saying like, "Hey, this is what I do," or "Come and study with me." I think that's a little bit of a Shaolin approach to mentorship that I don't think it's the right one.
And maybe it's the old model now with the sort of the freedom of information, and you can be in contact with people all over the world. Maybe that's outdated, but also we don't have a sport with a great history, years. We don't have the massive figures that perhaps some sports that have been around a long time have. So there hasn't been that opportunity. I mean, it's a very young sport, all things considered. So there isn't those kind of opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
So another question was the role of the NGB, and again, I think we probably have already covered this to some degree, but I suppose in terms of mentorship, in terms of coaching, I mean, you could think of it in different ways, but it's one thing that certainly makes me think. I'll interpret the question. Back in Victoria when I was out there. From about 2001 to 8, we had a coach education program at the NCI where there was sort of a kind of a mentorship role, but certainly there was meant to be a master coach and apprentice coach roles, and that's the way it was designed. But a number of coaches came through that, and then that stopped. And I've seen that in other countries as well, where the opportunity to learn from other coaches on the ground is something that many NGBs don't do. For example, in USA Triathlon now, they have some of the best women in the world, and yet how many coaches, American coaches, are learning from these experiences with these athletes. Mm-hmm. And I can tell you the answer is basically nil. And that's not a very good situation to be in. If you've got big champions from your country and you're not leveraging that from both an athlete perspective and a coach perspective to learn, I think that's an opportunity missed. And certainly when I look to other environments, you look at Leeds and in the UK, and not only are many athletes learning from the Brownlees and now Non and Vicky Holland, but coaches can come and observe in that environment too, and that's very powerful for long term. And I know that's happening in other places, but it's also not happening in some places, and I think it's there's all sorts of reasons why not, but I think it's a missed opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think perhaps one last question before we move on to the main topic, and just really, maybe emphasizing what real coaching is about and what it's meant to be. And I think there's perhaps it's a misunderstanding, or even a criticism of some coaches that are very successful business wise, and I think that actually misses the point of what this is about. This is meant to be about, and what real coaching is. And it's not, of course, that you can't have a successful business, but that you're in the pursuit of real coaching on deck with athletes, changing and improving performance. And although it's not mutually exclusive, but we do see, and I think everyone can agree, the proliferation of coaches, I think, has diluted what real coaching is. And I think that, even the resonance that we've gotten from this show, the feedback so far, I think there's a lot of people that do appreciate what it is and what it isn't. But and I think in general, the ones that, coaches that appear to be more of about marketing and about appearance. I mean, everybody knows and can see that. I mean, it's the same in any industry. You're either authentic and legitimate, or you're not. And I think that's what we want coaching to be about, and we want to promote that.
Yeah. I think that when you have an environment where age groupers train in a way that are very different from what the best athletes in the world train, you might stop and think, like, what is going on here, and what's going on here is business. You have triathlon personal trainers saying that you absolutely have to train with a power meter. You have triathlon personal trainers saying that you have to have a VO2 test, or you have to have lactate testing, or you have to have a lot of services that coincidentally they offer. And when you see that most of the best triathletes in the world don't have this kind of approach to training, you might think, like, what's going on here? And what's going on here is business. One thing that I often rail against as well is coaches that coach their elites more like age groupers instead of coaching their age groupers more like elites. And this means that the world of age group coaching and personal training invades more the elite coaching world than the elite coaching world invades the personal training world, and with that, I think that we're moving away from real coaching. So a lot of the times, what I would like to see and what I would call real coaching is when people are truthful in delivering coaching in person and no BS, just performance-oriented practice that is targeted to every kind of athlete, and to me that's real coaching. When you have athletes that are being told, age groupers that are being told that they absolutely have to have this or that or this little device or this or like one thing that drives me nuts, it's the lactate testing for age groupers, or it's not real coaching. You're trying to push a service to people, and obviously there's going to be buyers out there, but it's not real coaching. And I think this podcast, or the motivation to discuss about these things, are basically to empower the coaches out there that want to do it this way, do it the way which is performance oriented to whatever level the athlete is, and at the same time that are not out there to push a service or push their business, but for the coaching aspect of it.
That's very well said. So we can move to the main topic of today, which is polarized training. And this is a popular term. There's a lot of information and discussion about this, as there tends to be when you can apply a label to something, because it tends to simplify things, at least to some degree. And when you see it in the popular media, it can become it becomes a bit irritating. I find when it's like when I think that there's a slightly more legitimacy to this than reverse periodization that was going around some years ago. In fact, I came across that on the old triathlon book. blog that I dug up for the last episode. Some notes on that, but what is polarized training in your view, Paulo?
So Stephen Seiler, who's an exercise science professor in Norway, popularized the term, and he's done some research on it. And the basic concept is that looking to the training practices of elite athletes throughout the years, a pattern comes up where it seems that the athletes are either doing most of their work at low intensity, and then so around 80 to 90% of the work at low intensity, and then the rest of it are doing it at very high intensity, and they spend very little time training in between. So if you have 3 training zones that are basically zone 1 between rest and the first threshold, zone 2 between the first threshold and the second threshold, and zone 3 above that, then most of the training is done on zone 1, and a small percentage is done on zone 3, and very little training is done on zone 2. And there's some research pointing towards it, and this research is basically observation of the practice of several elite athletes in running, cross country skiing, cycling, and the evidence is there that might point towards that. And the concept of polarized training is obviously very interesting, just because it comes from direct observation of training of the elites throughout decades, and if it might point the way to maybe this is the right way, or the more efficient way, or the more effective way of training. And I think that's why it's captures so many's imagination.
So there's a very good YouTube video of Stephen Seiler giving a presentation at an endurance conference in Kent in the UK, and we'll link to that in a number of resources. But the video is worth watching, and certainly gets you thinking about this. There's a couple of things that may be different, for triathlon people thinking about this, is that the 3-zone terminology may be a bit different than how different models. So basically combining zone 1 and 2, and then that's zone 1 in the Seiler model, etc. So go watch the videos, follow the links to understand a little bit more about this after you listen to this podcast. But when I'm thinking about it, first of all, maybe a little bit like philosophy, I come across these labels and concepts, and you think, I wonder how this applies to what I'm doing, and and the answer is, I don't know. Like, I've got to go look at it. Is there a basis here? But then, so I did do that, and I'll give some numbers from doing a little bit of prep for this show, but also having thought about it earlier in the year. But yes, one of the concepts of is it self-evident? Well, of course, athletes do a lot of training at zone 1 and 2. I mean, how could you do it any other way? We know that athletes can't do all of their volume at high intensity, which I think is perhaps not really the point. However, it is worth emphasizing, particularly when we talked about maybe what makes triathlon different, and actually what makes it slightly more complex to make an evaluation of what we're actually doing is, how do these intensities, differ across the sports, and is there different sort of doses of high intensity that is sort of doable at, say, for swimming, for example, compared to running, where the same duration or the same dose of high intensity may not actually be possible or may not be advised. So there's a number of things that get me thinking about it, but one of them, is this actually self-evident?
Yeah, I think that the polarized training paradigm was a little put forward because we went through a period where the whole thing was about threshold training, and about how threshold training was, and this was like all the stuff in the 90s and early 2000s, which was, it's the most effective way of training, and that created schools of training. There's that word again, philosophies that were very centered in on threshold training, and the narrative behind polarized training is, well, let's go and look at how athletes really let's look at how athletes really train, and also athletes or schools of training that haven't been contaminated by the concept of threshold training, and that's basically like in running, for example. One of the first polarized training papers was with Spanish runners, and I would say that there's a very strong school of training there that probably was not contaminated by sports science and the threshold model, and at the same time also polarized training also surfaced a little bit on the back of all the research coming out about high intensity training, and so those two were a little bit combined. For me, what made me notice it more was a particular paper that we'll put on the podcast notes, which is a paper that's very well done, where you had you even had like a crossover. You had a crossover design. So basically, so you had two groups, one doing polarized training, the other one doing threshold training, and then after a period where they were not training at all, the athletes switched. So that's a crossover. That's the crossover design, and then the athletes that were doing polarized did the threshold, and vice versa. And with that paper, it was interesting that the athletes that did the polarized training with less work, with less training, and any way you want to account for that, either through work performed or work performed at above threshold or whatever, the athletes that did the threshold model trained more than the athletes that were doing the polarized model. And but the athletes that were doing the polarized model, the polarized training improved a lot more than the athletes that were doing the threshold model. And that, along with other pieces of evidence, was basically like the paper that made me like notice more polarized training, because it was very solid evidence that with less you could improve more, and definitely something that when I first saw it, was probably like 2 or 3 years ago, made a big mark with a lot of things on how I plan training, particularly in cycling, but also with in swimming and running.
Yeah, I mean, I think you raise really interesting points there about the dominance of the threshold model, or even the sweet spot model, which perhaps we could differentiate between. But I see this when I'm talking to coaches, and I've done a bit of work with some different coaches where we looked at their practices, and I continued to see this drive to do race pace or threshold type work throughout the season. I would say too early in the season, and do too much of it for too long. And that really, I recall in that specific case pointing the coach to some of Seiler's work here and saying, hey, look at this, have a look at this and compare it to what you're doing and look at this distribution. I think there's a lot of things going on here, but in the video, the presentation video, there's this concept of toxicity that comes up, and Seiler says, well, there's not. He doesn't believe there's kind of a toxic intensity, but a toxic distribution of training. And this is something that resonated with me, is the amount that doing too much of threshold training, for example, to contrast to polarized training, could in fact be toxic in that it more than the right dose can wear athletes down and sort of tear them down rather than be a stimulus that which they can adapt from and improve from. And so that's something that I've definitely thought about and observed, and particularly over time, sort of the eagerness of. This comes into the holistic nature of training and how we want to prove to ourselves that we can race at a certain speed. So we'll go out and the classic is how many athletes around the world do 10 by a K on the track or something like that, and add race pace with short rest, and trying to make it as specific as possible. But the thing that I think about is, well, some of that is okay, and I certainly do some of the race pace stuff still. Over the years, I probably do less and think that you need less than more, but too much of that is clear that can go in the wrong direction. So this is really what this is about, is it's distributions of training and how we organize training, and I think it's really important concepts.
One thing that I was actually a little surprised how popular the whole thing of polarized training became. And one thing that raised a red flag with me is some people sell it as 80-20, so 80% of your training at low intensity and 20% at high intensity. And I'm thinking like, wow, 20%, that's a big percentage, big percentage of high intensity. And with everything that's associated with intensity, I always think, and this might be a little bit of an old school, or might seem like a bit of an old school way of thinking, but it's a way of thinking that comes from working with athletes on a daily basis, which is when you do a lot of intense work, you might do it, but you don't do it for a long time. Basically, high intensity requires a level of mental commitment towards a session, a particular session, and athletes only have so much in the mental commitment tank, So a lot of times when I'm planning a week of training, I'm already thinking like, if this athlete's already doing this intense session, on Monday, probably is not going to be able to do another one on Tuesday, not because he or she cannot accomplish it, because they probably can, but because from a sustainability point of view, it's not going to be the best. So two things regarding polarized training raise red flags, particularly when applied to age group athletes. Is the first one is, are these athletes doing too much high intensity? And as you know, with the advent of the power meter, you have people in their basements doing absolutely insane trainer workouts, very intense trainer workouts, which will get them results at short term, but they're very hard to sustain on the long term. And at the same time, the biggest key about polarized training is the amount of training that you're doing at the low intensity. It's not really about the high intensity training provides a balance and hits on the physiological variables that low intensity training is not hitting on, but the bulk of the work, the most important thing is the volume of low intensity training that is done. And as you know, with time constrained athletes, there's no room to do a ton of work at low intensity. So when I see polarized training being popularized, I think the first thing that I think is, where's the sustainability of the high intensity, and what are the long-term consequences of doing so much high intensity work? But the biggest thing in my mind is these athletes are not doing the low intensity, the amount of low intensity work that they need to improve.
No, I think that sustainability is an important concept, whether we're talking for age group recreational athletes or elite athletes, and it's often it falls off the type of studies that we see, which typically aren't very long-term studies. Although some of this work is based on elite performance modeling, which I think gives it some legitimacy, as you said, it's top down rather than bottom up. But the sustainability of it, and yeah, it's very tempting, isn't it? We've seen this with the popularization of high intensity, ultra short intervals, and this sort of thing, which demonstrates some improvement in the short term for sure. But I think the sustainability of it is what comes into question, and there's all sorts of reasons. And when you've been trying to implement concepts like this with different athletes, and these are the sorts of things you see over time, is, all right, you want to do, as you said, 20% of your training at 90% of VO2 max or over, which is sort of described as one of the high intensity pole, 90% of VO2 max, and then do some math, and you think, well, that's really quite a lot of work at high intensity. Is that actually is that a good idea? But of course we focus on that instead of, all right, if we simplify this down, 80% is actually easy or basic intensities, and a lower percentage, perhaps 65% of VO2 max is the low intensity pull. So it's tempting to really focus on the high intensity, but is there any shortcuts really here? And is that what appeals to people, is looking at if I do this really high intensity stuff, as you say, the insane trainer sessions in the basement all winter, are you is that actually sustainable, or will you actually improve in the same way? And I think my argument is no. You're gonna limit the rate of the improvement that you can make over the long term. You get a short term improvement, but then you'll start to find problems when you have too much high intensity. Whether that be, as you say, perhaps easier to implement in cycling. Try to do this with running for many people, and you're gonna run into problems.
Yeah, one thing that we've mentioned, Tyler, and the research that is done in the last decades on polarized training and high intensity training. It's research that I really like. There's a lot of really good lessons to learn from a lot of his papers, and we're going to put a few links on the show notes. But I also would encourage people to just go into and go down the rabbit hole of PubMed and search more on this stuff. There's a lot of really good stuff. At the same time that I see a lot of dangers with polarized training and high intensity training. At the same time, I also feel that one thing that has changed the way I see training, and this, I think this applies particularly with bike training, with cycling training, because it's the safest training that you can do at high intensity, because it's going to be very hard for you to get injured on the bike just training. And one thing that definitely changed my mind is that I felt that it was not every kind of athlete that would be able to do, the famous 2 by 20 minutes at FTP It's a kind of like that threshold intensity is a kind of middle intensity that's very hard for some athletes to sustain for a long time. But I've noticed that when you tell athletes to focus on shorter intervals, more rest, and higher intensity, they actually perform a lot better. So basically, telling an athlete to do a 1 hour time trial is going to be a workout that's going to be very taxing from a mental point of view in executing, while telling an athlete to do 6 by 4 minutes all out with 4 minutes rest, while it's a very hard workout, it's a workout that athletes finish it by thinking like, well, I really executed it well. I was able to perform well at that workout. I was better than last week. And so this whole approach changed my outlook, or the way I understand things, where I understood that for most athletes, it's easier for them to focus on maximum efforts for a shorter time of actual work than focusing on for a longer time at those middle intensities.
Those kind of, bread and butter threshold sessions are not for everybody, and under high chronic load, they're hard to execute well and consistently, and breaking things down to shorter, higher intensity can be more doable and achievable. And, whether we're talking about athletes that are training very close to the total workload that they can sustain, or whether we're talking about age group athletes whose limitations are more the time, that, the concept is still important of, what can you achieve, and what are you setting yourself up to achieve, and what is the cost to achieve that? And I think it's perhaps underrated is, well, sure, athletes, some athletes, we all hear and see athletes doing phenomenal training sessions, but what is the cost of doing those? And certainly, when I think of some of the sessions we do, and I'm sure when new athletes come to our group and they think, no, this isn't very hard, really. None of these sessions are monster sessions. Nobody's, letting the world on fire here. And I think, well, but that's actually part of how you become consistent and how you do the chronic work over the long period of time is by moderating to some degree the cost of the training that you're doing so you can absorb it. And one of the ways is by breaking things down, which is not a new concept. I mean, these kind of broken sessions, I mean, the classic session you talk about, or even shorter, like, many reps of 1 minute or 2 minutes. And, you can do those in different ways, but where you're breaking it into achievable chunks that the athletes can do under high training load. And I think that's one of the important concepts here. Again, that it's very easy to focus on the intensity. And one of the comments I saw in following a Twitter discussion about this is, what should the anchors be? Is it the high intensity sessions? Is it the total volume? And my understanding in practice as well was, the high intensity sessions between development elite athletes and elite athletes, the volume of high intensity, and we're not talking about juniors here, but senior athletes, developing senior athletes versus world-class senior athletes, that the volume of the high intensity sessions is not substantially different. But what is typically different is the total volume or the total workload that's being done while the athletes are doing these same high intensity sessions. And that seems to be the differentiator. And we sort of know that intuitively that, that athletes that are, or some may know it intuitively, but that athletes that are particularly good within a training group, and you see this within a club or within a group, is the top athletes tend to be more consistent through periods of training blocks or periods of time. And yeah, certainly some of them are better on the big sessions, but in my experience and what I look for is the consistency with which they're able to execute the high intensity sessions. So coming back to I think there's a a temptation to anchor this kind of thinking around the high intensity when I think it's actually the total volume that's important here, and that tends to skew towards higher percentages at lower intensities more than the reverse.
I think that also like one thing that what we're saying points towards is that coaches always we kind of like to read the tea leaves during the workouts that we have, and a lot of the times both athletes and coaches get a little carried away with performance at training sessions, and it's not about that, is it? It's about how this session or this week or this month contributes to performance in racing. So a lot of the times we design sessions that are more or less test sessions, or sessions that we want to see, like, I want to see this athletes do just like this amazing performance and see how it goes. And sometimes it goes well, sometimes it doesn't, but it's really pointless if it doesn't have a translation into racing. Another comment that I would make is that I've had pretty good athletes that are pretty bad at doing intensity workouts. and a lot of times they can't push the watts, they can't push the pace, they can't do whatever I thought that they could do, or that I think that they can do. But then the whole process, the whole training process ends up in those athletes having good races and being good performers. So in the end, what comes out of this is that it's not about the sessions, it's not about performance at the sessions, which is a big focus right now, which is performance at the sessions, and it's more about how the whole thing, the whole summation of what we do translates into race day.
Yeah, I mean, in that, come back to the point about distribution. What is the distribution, and how do all of these factors come together? So looking at so again, when these things sort of come up, I'm like, I don't know, what do I actually do? So I'll have a look. I don't know. I'd never applied this label before. So, thanks to power meters, we've got some amount of data. So this will only be about the bike. So I'll just look at a few numbers from different athletes and making some assumptions. One, that the power meter is calibrated and accurate, which is not always a good assumption. That there is not massive data holes, which is always it's not always a good assumption. In practice, when you have a large group of athletes with a large number of different power meters, and you realize this is why you don't rely on these devices for your coaching, because half of them are broken continually. But in any case, so looking at, I happen to have this set up in a 6-zone model, so it's automatically divided. So I look at zone 1 and 2, if we in a 6-zone model, should correlate to Seiler's zone 1. So it looks like 65% of when I combine those two zones. And cycling, you typically get a little bit higher zone 1 than I would like. When I look at these graphs, I think, that's too much zone 1. But that often happens. It depends the terrain where you were, and whether you're riding in groups or solo, etc. But in any case, 65%. Then when I combine the next two zones, 3 and 4, I come up with 20%. And then the remainder, it should add up to about 15%, if I've done my math. So that's zone 5 and 6. So, I mean, that doesn't really fit the 80-20, because obviously there's something in the middle. But that's just out of interest, a distribution of one of the athletes ahead. So that was 65, 20, 15. I think if I've done the sums correctly. So we'll open up a different athlete to have a look. And I think of which of my athletes have good data sets, and then I'm thinking, not many of them do. Mm-hmm. Looking at again, real coaching, thinking if these things are broken all the time.
Isn't that the practice on that if we wanted like good data, that's just a full-time job to just get the athletes and a lot of them are really not inclined to get into collecting good data. But just if we wanted like really good data with all of our athletes, that would be a full-time occupation to just be on top of them, or make sure that they had like 2 power meters, so that one craps out the other one. You can substitute with another one. It would be a full-time job.
Oh yeah, I mean it's unbelievable how many of these problems we end up having. Whether it be batteries or the pedals breaking, the pods, or we've got all sorts of different ones. But again, a reason why you don't want to rely completely on devices. It's a real life practicality, unless you're you've got a huge budget and you've got a person whose job is simply to have these things charged and synced and ready to go, then then you may not.
So maybe I can sell you into using what I use, which is a session RPE, and have the athletes collect the data, and that way I get consistent data across every athlete. But I'm digressing here.
Do you want to go into that at all, or should we save that for another?
We can talk about that some other day. Yeah.
Okay. Right. Well, I looked at another athlete who's pretty good at downloading data. We've got also 65% at zone 1, zone 2, but then actually zone 3 and zone 4 have 30%, and the remainder, which is very small, is at high intensity. So that's actually much smaller at the high intensity. And then when I was reflecting on this athlete, I thought, well, you know what, that makes sense, because I find this particular athlete has have a lot of anaerobic capacity, anaerobic power, and we tend not to use it very often in training because we're trying to develop the endurance and conditioning and that profile, and to perhaps a way underdo. So there's another reason why these things might be different. These distributions, and what the optimal distribution may be different. So the problem of sort of blanket models and labels of across different athletes is the athlete, know what the distribution is. I'll look at one other one just because I'm looking at it. I've got another athlete who is zone 1 and zone 2 is 87%. So they're quite high at zone 1 and zone 2. And then again, I've got to go look, and why might that be? Are the thresholds not set correctly, etc. But they're looking at 3 different athletes. I've got 3 different distributions. And of course, that's just cycling, and again, that coming back to, well, how do you apply this across?
Cycling is very particular because also the way athletes ride changes training a lot. One observation that I have with my training group is that, for example, women are better at riding at like a higher aerobic intensity than men. So I have a few of my women that are really good at riding, let's say like 75% of FTP. And so if they have a ride 1 hour and a half at that intensity, they will hit that intensity. While men, a lot of the men that I coach have difficulty riding at that intensity. Also because 75% of their FTP ends up being pretty fast riding and at higher wattage, right? And a lot of times I will have some of my athletes, particularly the men, ride at a way lower intensity than the women. So from that perspective, I also feel that individual characteristics of an athlete will impact the way they train, and we as coaches need to also take that into account. On the other hand, for example, most of the evidence towards polarized training is done with cross-country skiers or with runners, where just by the characteristics of the activity, it's easier to polarize training, because a lot of the low intensity training is very mindless. It's just like slow miles. And while with cycling, it's a little bit different, because depending on terrain or riding with other people and individual characteristics are going to affect the breakdown of where they're going to train.
So we've covered this from a few different angles. So what's the summary? Do you have takeaways here on should age groupers use polarized training? Should elites use polarized training?
I think my personal takeaway is that from the approach that not every session you have to be on, not every session you have to be able to hit this specific intensity. So from that point of view, I think that the lesson that every kind of athlete, and I think both age groupers and elites can take, is that there is a way of training where you do most of your work at a low intensity, that you really don't have to focus a lot on it, and then you have a couple of times a week where you really focus on going hard, and the distinction between going easy and going hard is very marked, very definite. So I think that from the whole concept of polarized training, the lesson coming from there is that we're going to focus, we're going to go hard when we go hard. I don't like to say like go hard when make your easy days easy and your hard days hard. I think that's kind of like a little bit simplistic, but I think that the concept of using low intensity and having to use high intensity and not getting caught in mid intensities that give you there's not a big trade-off. Middle intensities don't enhance your training significantly, but do cut up on the total amount of training load that you can get in. So the lesson that I would take from the whole polarized training thing is work on polarizing more your training, and also looking to shorten your intense sessions so that you're going to focus on getting the most out of yourself for a shorter time, and the whole approach hopefully will need a lot less mental commitment to hitting a specific intensity than the threshold model.
Yeah, but I like that way of thinking about it. I mean, I think that's a common thing that athletes do, even at very high levels, is they don't distinguish enough between the hard sessions and the easy sessions, and or they're trying to make the easy ones too hard, or they get stuck doing it. As I said, I don't like the simplistic way that goes around the easy days easy, hard either. Mm-hmm. However, it is a common pattern, and thinking of it this way in terms of the poles of focus on your hard sessions, make them good. And then a lot of these easy sessions, I mean, whether it's zone 1 or zone 2, perhaps doesn't matter quite as much in the 5-zone model. It's chill out a bit, go take it easy, and don't try to be, particularly I think this is the problem with the ability to measure things all the time, which can be counterproductive, particularly for running. We're always athletes are always looking at their GPS watches and they end up running too fast inevitably because they don't like to see slow numbers. And I'm always reinforcing, chill out on your easy runs. Run it African style or however you think of it. That's often what I say. Run your easy runs like Rich Murray. He's always getting dropped from everybody on his easy runs, and then the dude is one of the fastest guys in the world. And if I can run with Rich, then I think there's something there, that you make the good sessions count and make the easy ones easy.
The same here. Like I never worry about I never worry about pace for those easy runs. I just say like it's going to be cruise intensity, so it's not going to be easy. It's cruise intensity, but then each athlete will have his or her interpretation of what cruise is. And I know that some of my male elites might be doing like cruise runs at 7 minutes or 6:30 per mile. Some others are going to be doing 7:30 or even 8 minutes per mile, and I don't really think that's going to be a big deal because I like to allow athletes to just on some days they just turn off their brain and just go and do a session, so that we can preserve that mental freshness to when for the days that we really need to go hard.
I mean, I think that's the nuance to the discussion here, is looking at it holistically. So I think it's a good starting point if you've not looked at this concept before. So again, we'll have the links, the video, the presentation, some of the papers, some places where you can learn a little bit more about this, and maybe have a look at your own training and preparation, and take some of those concepts, because I think there is, as we said, some merit here to explore and gets you thinking about it. Certainly as you said, it did for you, but it's got me thinking about it a little bit more, and some of these concepts I've been able to apply or certainly reflected in practice. So I think it's a good place to wrap it up. So we'll put the links to follow myself and Paulo on from Twitter. Also, a good place to follow the squads and the athletes is on Facebook. And we'll put those links in. Certainly, it's the place where I post a lot of photos or videos or other interesting things that we find. Sometimes performances and that, but sometimes just look behind the scenes or some little videos or comments from the athletes. So we'll put a link to the triathlon squad.
Yeah, same here. We're pretty active on Facebook, and you can just find us on the triathlon squad on Facebook. And let me just plug that my squad, we're doing a fundraiser for this month. So if you feel inclined to donate for the squad, just go to the triathlonsquad.com/donate, or you can go from our Facebook page, and I'm sure you've seen the awesome bike kits that we have. So for a $500 donation, you get one of those bike kits. So yeah, #donate.
Sounds good. So we'll put all those links up, and I hope everyone got something out of the training talk today. I mean, some of what we're going to talk about, is high performance and some of the bigger picture stuff. But I think there's a lot of interesting things, concepts in training, preparation that we can get into. We've touched on them. So reminder that to send questions, comments, feedback, either email podcast@joelfilliol.com, on Twitter at joelfilliol, at PS Triathlon, or via one of the Facebook pages. We've had stuff come in from all angles. So one of these days we'll maybe do a show, all feedback or comments, questions. I think we could have done that twice already, and we've only just started. So keep it rolling in. It's nice to have the interaction and to know actually someone is listening and appreciating what we're talking about. So we'll until next time, get the questions rolling in, and we'll continue.
Yeah, that was good. Thanks, Joel.